The true worth of a man is written in the ridges of his shins. Richard Israel Pogmore, 1881. You're listening to Shinbones, the curated journals of Peter Culross. Episode 1. A proper sporting occasion. A man had been kicked to death, not shot or poisoned or run through with a cutlass. No, he'd actually been kicked to death. I hadn't known that such thing was even possible, so this was a bit of a game changer. Of course, as a rough and tumble 6-year-old, I'd witnessed violence on films and on the telly, cowboys, pirates, war movies, etc. And like most boys, I quite enjoyed a bit of cinematic savagery. But my exposure thus far typically involved pistols, swords, and more than a fair share of sanitisation. It was pretty rare for blood to be shown, or anything overly gratuitous for that matter. It was more in the line of, "Bang bang, you're dead," or "Avast you scurvy dogs." Nothing I'd seen so far had prepared me for the real world of brutality. One man raining kicks on another until his innards burst? Well, this was a different league. My grandad Bill was the harbinger of the disturbing tale. It was a drizzly Saturday afternoon in the late 1970s, and the womenfolk were shopping at the local market. This left just me and Bill in his tiny front room on my grandparents' Victorian terrace. The wrestling had finished nearly an hour ago, and we'd turned off the telly and sat in silence reading our respective comics and newspapers. As ever, Bill was seated in his well-loved leather armchair, while I took the fluffy maroon rug in front of the electric fire. Grandad had switched on just one bar, which was enough to take the chill out the room, but wouldn't break the bank in the same way that 2 bars would. Nevertheless, it was cosy, warm, and peaceful. For a while, anyway. Eventually, true to form, I'd got bored and set about haranguing Bill to entertain me. Such is the way of young boys. Initially reluctant to forsake the beloved sports section of his newspaper, my determined attempts at being increasingly annoying eventually got his attention. That wet afternoon, my grandfather's idea of entertaining a 6-year-old was to recount a story of horrible violence. And what's more, he delivered it in his signature matter-of-fact fashion, which in its own way made it all the worse. It somehow implied that this sort of thing was perfectly normal. As far as my knowledge of fighting went, the tale was more than a bit of an eye-opener. A metaphorical curtain had been pulled aside to reveal that the world was very different from what I'd been led to believe. Men could commit atrocious cruelty on each other, and it wasn't in a story or a book, or on the telly, but true. Now, any reasonable person might ask why a mature adult, who quite frankly should have known much better, would be filling a young boy's head with something so macabre. To understand better, you'll need a bit of context to this story. My grandfather was a grumpy, esoteric individual with a wickedly sharp sense of humour. He loved his family dearly, but was never known to suffer fools gladly. He was the type of man who would bite your head off one minute and give you 10 pence for a bag of chips the next. He also had more than his fair share of eccentric habits, including being weirdly evasive when asked something which at face value seemed innocuous. Bizarrely, and I kid you not, Bill's standard answer to most of my questions was Dicky Poggy. For instance, when's the snooker on, Grandad? Dicky Poggy. How old are you, Grandad? Dicky Poggy. Who is Dicky Poggy, Grandad? Dicky Poggy. He would delight in my frustration. His toothy smile would grow along with my temper. Previous to that afternoon, I'd most likely pestered him going on 10,000 times to tell me who Dicky Poggy was. And I guess my dogged determination had finally worn him down, because he relented and at last told me the truth. Well, his own version of it anyway. As you will learn, it's not exactly easy to pin down the facts where Poggy is concerned. But here's an edited account of the story anyway. Now, Dicky Poggy was a fighter. Not a fighter in the big daddy world of sport, Saturday telly sense, but a real fighter. A dedicated sportsman and a superb athlete. A working class legend who was amongst the elite of his sport when his sport had been the most popular in northern England. Cricket, football and rugby were for toughs and soft lads. Poggy's sport was only for granite chiselled men. Fighters were frequently lamed, disfigured and killed. Even the victors risked succumbing to infection and gangrene. Wives were widowed, children were left destitute and given into the care of the workhouse. And of course, gambling was endemic, and the whole grotesque spectacle was fueled by filthy lucre. To be clear, Dicky was not a boxer, and he most certainly was no wrestler. Due to the passage of time, the prejudices surrounding northern culture, and also the general lack of reference points, most people today would view his martial art as something quaint, amusing, harmless even. They'd be dead wrong on all accounts. Clog fighting was obscene violence in its purest form. Men wearing wooden or steel-toe capped leather fighting boots would hack at each other's bare legs until one submitted or was unable to continue the bout. In preparation for matches, fighters would strike their own shins with hammers until the nerves were dead. I found this particular caveat disturbing, and the thought is no more pleasant today. At the heart of Bill's story was the familiar trope of a sporting contest, a world title match no less. One that, due to a fighter being savagely kicked to death, would become notorious. Dicky Poggy, as the hardest fighter in England, he was set to face his American counterpart. Bill couldn't quite remember the name of this transatlantic opponent, but painted the picture of a giant, toothless halfwit who'd been pressed into the sport by a bunch of ruthless German gangsters. Now, at 6 years old, I really had no idea what a gangster was. I had, however, heard quite a bit about the evil Germans. This was 1970s Britain after all. The Second World War had happened only a few decades before, and comedians still made jokes about the Luftwaffe bombing their local chippy. My understanding stretched as far as bad people forcing a simple-minded man into a life of horrible brutality. I didn't really get why there were bad German men living in America, and it would be years before I learned about the whole Pennsylvania mining connection. But the point is, as bad as the prospect of a man being kicked to death was, it was made all the worse for knowing that the victim was a giant with the mind of a child, and also that had been forced into the contest by villains of the worst kind. Eventually, I'd learned that this grotesque depiction of the American was pure fantasy. He was no simpleton. He'd actually organised the fight under his own volition for pride and profit. But that Saturday afternoon, I'd lapped up every single one of Bill's words. His own father, Ernest, had actually been employed by the fight's bookmakers as a child bobby spotter. He'd been very young at the time, and may have confused hearsay for fact when recounting the tale in later years. Or more likely, knowing Bill, he was simply embellishing the story for dramatic effect. The fight, as was not untypical of the time, was held in the backyard of a public house. Prior to conversion, the building had once been the site of a small dairy farm, and where there once stood cows and cattle sheds, now stood nothing but open space and cobbles. Perfect for an occasion such as this, and it was here at the Malt Shovel at Stalybridge, just a stone's throw from where Lancashire, Derbyshire and Yorkshire meet, that patriotic bunting was hung in support of Poggy's claim to the title. My great-grandad Ernest's role was to keep a lookout for the policemen who would inevitably materialise to make sure everything stayed within the law. It was not that the contests were illegal in themselves. No, It was the unlicensed gambling that worried those that held the bobbies' leashes. The landowners, the mill owners, the rich and powerful. If betting was unlicensed, then it couldn't be taxed. And if it couldn't be taxed, then those bastards in charge wouldn't get their due. As with much of Bill's tale, this didn't make a lot of sense at the time. I didn't understand the concept of tax or licenses. If I'd been a bit older, I might have stood a chance of figuring it out. It would ultimately have been pointless though, because what he was telling me was a load of bollocks. The police of the day were actually in the payroll of the bookie gangs, and the rich and powerful enjoyed the spectacle of a good fight right alongside the unwashed masses. So, what was the real role of a bobby spotter? What was the point? Well, it turns out that in the distant past, a spotter would keep a lookout for the local constabulary. This was at a time when fights were smaller, the profits were less, and the gangs were much less powerful. But over the years, the unlicensed bookmakers grew in both wealth and status. Fights could be hugely lucrative affairs. High-profile bouts would profit the gangs by hundreds of thousands of pounds by today's standards. Inevitably, the police were in the pocket of the local bookies, and they'd happily look the other way to a spot of illegal gambling in order to fill their coffers and retain their kneecaps. So a bobby spotter's job was no longer to keep an eye out for snooping policemen. Now, their anachronistically titled role was to keep an eye out for trespassing gangs. One gang waylaying about on another's turf was a very real threat at this point. Clogging was big business, and the juvenile bobby spotters were vital cogs in a much larger machine. The violence outside the fighting circle between rival bookies could be a magnified reflection of that within. On a fight day, young spotters would be positioned all around the town, each one carrying a wooden rattle. This wasn't the same kind of rattle that you might give to a baby, but rather a noisy, homemade toy of the sort that would be used by football fans a generation later. If a spotter clapped eye on a dubious-looking outsider, he'd furiously spin his rattle so it could be heard by the nearest spotters to him. In turn, they would spin their own wooden rattles for the spotters nearest to them to hear, and so on, and so on. This aural beacon would soon make its way to where the fight was being staged, and the bookie soldiers and policemen would be promptly dispatched to stop the interlopers in their tracks. The last thing a local gang wanted was for the fight to be interrupted and for all bets to be classed null and void. Where was the profit in that? On this most prestigious of fight days, young Ernest had landed himself the plum bobby spotter's location, the one at the main entrance to the malt shovel's backyard. He'd climb up on top of the high wall and have an excellent view of all the violence to come. He wouldn't have to listen to second-hand accounts of the match like his mates. Ernest would be a legend in their eyes. They already held a fearful respect of him on account of his uncle being a high-ranking member of the local gang, and it was assumed by all that my great-grandfather would inevitably follow in his footsteps. So, on a blisteringly hot day in 1886, the bunting was out and the spotters were in place. The fighting circle had been neatly marked with a thick length of rope nailed into the gaps in the cobbles. To prevent the clogmen slipping in their own blood and sweat, along with the warm beer that would be drunkenly thrown at them from the raucous crowd, sawdust had been liberally scattered across the ground. The yard was packed out with inebriated men, all merry and united in their excitement of the fight to come. Bookmakers' tables were set in each of the yard's corners, and poor working-class men made bets that might see their families go hungry for a week. The anticipation grew with each passing moment, ultimately exploding into a deafening roar as Dicky Poggy, the undefeated English clog fighting champion, entered the courtyard by the pub's back door. Poggy was a tall, imposing figure, wiry and dour. He was now in his 40s and, though no longer a young man, he carried himself with a surety of experience. As was the tradition, he dressed in his Sunday best, with his trousers rolled up past his knees to expose scarred and ridged shins that resembled corrugated iron. The fighter proudly wore his disfigurement like a badge of honour, and showed not a sign of fear. Not even a trickle of sweat betrayed him, despite the hot sun and his thick woolen suit. But as unwavering as his facade was, those that knew him best could tell that something wasn't quite as it should be. Poggy's skin was a little too pale, and the keenest eyes could make out his left hand almost imperceptibly trembling in the same way it had when he'd been a drinker. And he had been a drinker. People said he'd had an unquenchable thirst of almost biblical proportions. Rather than the violence of his sport, it had been gin and brandy that had nearly ended him years before. But he'd found a good woman, and now drank nothing stronger than milky tea. Dicky loved his wife with all of his heart, and only ever beat her in accordance with his Christian duty. "Okay, time out," I told Grandad Bill to hang on a minute. Was it really true that men hit women? That didn't seem right. He told me that I didn't know the half of it, and testily reminded me of the fact that he was attempting to tell a story, one which, if I needed reminding, had been prompted by my incessant moithering. Reluctant to risk missing the rest of the tale, I quickly told him to please carry on. But it wasn't too long before I found myself asking him to stop again. It had occurred to me that I didn't have the first clue about the rules of clog fighting, and the knowledge seemed kind of, well, essential to the story. I only knew that it involved kicking your opponent in some manner until what? Till he died? Or was it like wrestling? One fall, 2 submissions or a knockout? Bill thought on this for a second, before agreeing with a smile that I had a valid point. Understanding the rules would indeed make his account more enjoyable. However, as I was soon to learn, there was a slight problem with this. Clog fighting, or parring as it was more commonly called, was in fact governed by multiple codes. Indeed, rules could even differ greatly from town to town. However, on that rainy Saturday afternoon, Bill explained them to me as thus. 2 men fought in a small fighting circle, marked with either chalk or rope, clutching onto each other's shoulders. If one of the fighters stepped out or was forced out of the circle, they'd be awarded an infraction. The men's legs from ankle to knee must be bare. There were no rounds, rest periods, or timed length of contest. It ended when it ended. Clogs could be either wooden or leather, and the footwear could be adorned with studs, but nails and blades were not legal. Fighters could kick an opponent below the waistline only. Kicking above the waistline would mean an infraction. Slapping was allowed, but punches not. Again, an infraction would be given for a deviation from the rules. Shunting, or using your head to push an opponent away, was legal, but tupping, a straightforward headbutt, was not, and would land the offender with an infraction. A fighter won the bout if their opponent was unable to carry on, accumulated 3 infractions, or submitted defeat by crying out, "Sufficient!" The whole thing was umpired by a clog fighting official, usually known as an arbiter or a stickler, depending on regional variance. When Grandad Bill was duly satisfied that I'd understood his interpretation of the rules, and that he could carry on without interruption, the account continued. It was now the turn of the giant American to make his own impressive entrance. Like a bull on steroids, he barged directly through the throng of drunken revellers at the yard's gate, only an arm's length away from my great-grandfather. Ernest nearly fell off the wall in shock. The spectators declared the fighter to be the biggest man any of them had ever witnessed. Like Poggy, he too was dressed in his finest. Colossal muscles bulged beneath his suit, and his jacket stretched tightly across his barrel chest. Buttons strained desperately to stay in place, threatening to ping off at any second. He grinned in amusement at the jeers of the heavily partisan crowd, exposing his toothless mouth. Following close behind came a small group of his American supporters. Speaking mainly German, these were the second-generation Pennsylvanians that Ernest had mistaken for gangsters. The party proudly carried a banner adorning their champion's name, one which, to my frustration, had slipped my granddad's mind. Bill simply referred to him as the Giant Yank. A couple of years later, I read an article from a vintage sporting periodical dated a few weeks before the fight. It reported the Pennsylvanian fighter's name as being Lure Crumbine. Later still, a rudimentary bit of research told me that when translated into English, Lure roughly means war people and Crumbine means crooked legs. For a good while, I believed the name must have been contrived in the same show business fashion that modern wrestlers are awarded their ring names. It seemed just too perfect a coincidence for a champion para to be christened so aptly. I was wrong though. Astonishingly, this was indeed the Giant's given name. Unlike Crumbine, Poggy was known by various fighting names throughout his long career. Born Richard Israel Pogmore, he was intermittently known as Dicky Poggy, Slick Dick, and Dread Richard. I'd be less than surprised to find that other aliases could be added to that list too. Having a collection of fighting names seems to have been a common marketing strategy at the time. It was a frustrating gimmick that doesn't exactly help a curious researcher when over a century later they attempt to unearth information. With much shoving and yelling, the noisy rabble parted, as first Poggy, then Crumbine, made their ways into the small fighting circle. As they stood doggedly facing each other, both fighters endeavouring to stare the other down, the arbiter shouted the rules for the bout, for all and sundry to hear. It was critical that everyone concerned understood what constituted a win or loss, as this mitigated the very real risk of heated arguments and violence taking place between punters and bookies after the fight. With a confusing myriad of accepted parring codes in general use, the proclamation of the day's rules was a necessary formality. The code now clearly and precisely stated, both fighters gave a curt nod to affirm their acceptance. They took their opponent's shoulders in a rough grip, holding tightly to Sunday best jackets, and awaited the eagerly anticipated signal from the arbiter to begin. They weren't kept waiting long. With a booming cry of "Commence!" the bout was underway, and the violence was immediate and relentless. The huge American pounded Poggy with brutal kicks to the shins and knees over and over. A lesser fighter would have been floored within 10 seconds. Poggy used all of his experience to dodge the kicks as best he could, and then knocked Crumbine off balance with successive brutal slaps to each ear. As the American staggered, he raked the Giant's left shin from knee to ankle, exposing blood and bone. For good measure, a quick kick was thrust into Crumbine's side that knocked the wind right out of him. A cry of infraction went up from both the arbiter and more than a few of the drunken crowd. But Poggy's illegal above-the-waist kick had won him a few precious seconds' rest. No longer a young man, he relied on speed and fox-like cunning rather than explosive power to win his fights. His only realistic chance of beating the brutal Pennsylvanian was to push the rules as far as he dare without breaking them. Honour demanded that much. Crumbine, who must have been in agony, recovered enough composure to plant a crunching headbutt on Poggy's chin. A cry of "Top!" rang out of the crowd, followed by heated anger aimed at the few spectators who vehemently insisted it was merely a shunt. These few had probably bet their hard-earned rent money on the American, and were doing what little they could to influence the arbiter. However, according to Bill, the crunching sound Dicky's jaw made as it was tupped was akin to a mule throwing a spindle, a peculiar mill term that my granddad used ubiquitously to describe any particularly loud noise. Mule apparently being inventor Samuel Crompton's spinning mule. In any case, it was an easy decision for the arbiter to make. An infraction, it clearly was. Poggy blearily shook his head to clear his double vision, then spat out several teeth along with a thick stream of blood. Ever one to give credit where it was due, he nodded to his opponent in respectful acknowledgement of his martial skills, and then the fight continued even more frantically than before. Though the crowd were unaware of it, both men were fighting for much more than just a sparring title. The ghastly events that unfolded in the aftermath of the contest now added savage poetry to the day. At the time, though, the ignorant spectators simply delighted at the spectacle of two prime athletes trying their damnedest to eviscerate one another. The American was younger, stronger, and much taller and heavier than the Englishman, but Poggy was canny and quick. As Crumbine targeted a relentless stream of powerful kicks at his opponent's shins, Poggy danced left and right, dodging them, managing to hook his foot behind the American to gouge a nasty calf splitter with the jagged studs of his clog. This was a desperate tactic sometimes used to slow down a fitter clogger. As blood flowed from the wound, an opponent would get increasingly sluggish and cloudy of thought. Its major drawback being that it would leave the perpetrator vulnerable and unbalanced during its application. But Poggy was desperate. He was blowing hard, and unlike earlier, was sweating like the proverbial pig. He'd fought a hard 15-minute English Championship bout just 6 months before, and had shown not one sign of tiring on that triumphant day. Spectators had marvelled at the fitness of the middle-aged Poggy, but none of that legendary stamina was in evidence now. He was clearly flagging after just 3 minutes. Crumbine, taking full advantage of the English fighter's lack of balance, unleashed a crunching knee to Poggy's groin. There was a communal intake of air sucked through teeth as he tumbled out of the rope fighting circle and into the crowd. Infraction. Ow! I winced at Grandad Bill while crossing my legs. Ever sympathetic, he chortled wickedly and advised me that all you can do in a situation like that is to count them. Poggy, now outside of the fighting circle, sat shakily on the cobbles. The crowd cleared him some space as he vomited. His jaw was at best dislocated, and he'd lost several teeth. He may have ruptured a testicle or two. Could the old warrior come back from this? Those in the crowd who wagered on him shouted for him to get up, while his friends, and those who bet against him, raucously vocalised the opposite. Crumbine, his bloodlust up and supremely confident of victory, made beckoning gestures for him to re-enter the circle. Amazingly, Poggy gingerly pushed himself onto his knees and, grabbing hold of a spectator's coat, slowly holding himself to his feet. Maybe he was confident of the American slowing down due to the blood now freely flowing from his massive calf. Maybe he thought his experience and cunning might still win the day. Or maybe, given later revelations, it was simply a matter of pride. In any case, Poggy limped heavily back into the fighting circle and awaited the arbiter's signal to recommence. The order was quickly given and the bout continued in earnest. But Poggy was quite obviously in no fit state to compete. He swatted hopelessly at Crumbine with several slaps to the head and neck, but the giant American absorbed them easily and set about destroying his opponent's shins with one almighty blow after another. Crumbine's pace and power were relentless. Within 1 short minute, Poggy was crumbling and struggling to stay upright. The fighting ring cobbles were drenched with the blood of both cloggers, and they were treacherously slippery despite the thick sawdust. Crumbine was undeterred by the loss of blood from his leg wounds, throwing Poggy around like a rag doll. The Englishman desperately attempted one last futile kick before his legs buckled. The only thing keeping him from collapsing to the ground was the vice-like grip of Crumbine at his shoulders. As he hung there pitifully, the American champion inflicted kick upon brutal kick in an endeavour to permanently cripple him. Whether it was for the pure thrill of violence or for the potentially lucrative notoriety that disabling the English champion would afford, Crumbine continued regardless. Cries of "Sufficient!" went up from the crowd, but there were no lawful rules that allowed an arbiter to end a fight due to one of the cloggers being unfit to continue. Only infractions and submissions could end a bout. Anything beyond would void a match. The bookmakers would see to it that the arbiter would be found face down in the canal if they lost their profits to such an outcome. And so it was that the horrified crowd faced the inevitable. Poggy would lose the title and the use of his legs. Famously stubborn and proud, there was never any doubt he'd spare his body by submitting. He'd won every single fight he'd engaged in since the age of 15. As a teenager, he'd easily seen off opponents twice his age and weight. It was said that he'd even knocked his own father spark out because of the abuse his mother had been receiving at home. By 17, Poggy was a local legend, and even the notorious gangs were wary of him. So it was a dreadful shock to all when Poggy, tears welling in shame, finally spoke the one word that could end the violence. Sufficient. A gasp of astonishment went up from the crowd, and the giant American's ruthless kicks stopped immediately. Crippling a man during a fair competition was one thing. Causing serious injuries after an opponent had submitted was another. That could lead to hard prison time. Crumbine coolly released the grip of Poggy's jacket, and the Englishman crashed to the blood-soaked sawdust. He lay sobbing. The ignominy of defeat was just too much to bear. There was neither cheering nor jeering from the partisan English crowd, just distressed murmurs of incredulity at the savage beating of a local hero. Richard Israel Pogmore, the man they said was made of iron, was human just like the rest of them. Even Crumbine's retainers stayed noticeably silent, afraid to celebrate for fear of physical reprisals from the locals. The only sounds to be heard in the pub yard now were the hushed whispers of the crowd, the piteous sobbing of Dicky Poggy, and the sickening laughter of the giant American. As soon as his battered body would allow, Poggy hauled himself from the cobbles with the Herculean effort. He roughly pushed away and admonished his concerned friends, who were attempting to console him and tend to his many wounds. The crowd parted, and he staggered past the bookmakers towards the yard's exit. Still sobbing in shame, he limped heavily through the opening and vanished into history. Like an insufferable pedant, I chided my grandfather for fibbing. At the beginning of the tale, he'd clearly said that a man had been kicked to death. No one had died. Bill was visibly annoyed by my latest interruption, and quieted me with an impatient wave of his hand. He gave me fair warning that if I opened my gob just one more time, I could bugger off back to my comics and miss the end of it. Now, it had literally taken me thousands of frustrating attempts to persuade my grandfather to offer any facts about Dicky Poggy's identity in the first place. So under this threat, I quickly closed my mouth. Bill being Bill, he offered me a mint as a peace offering. I took one, and satisfied that I'd been appeased, he carried on with his tale. As Poggy had unsteadily made his way out of the yard, all eyes had been fixed on him. No one had noticed the triumphant smile leaving Crumbine's face. He now swayed as he stood, a thin trickle of blood coming from the side of his mouth. When they finally turned back to face him, his retainers realised immediately that something was very wrong. As they dashed towards him, Crumbine's eyes rolled back to show only the whites, and he crashed heavily onto the cobbles. Logically enough, his helpers' first instincts were to stem the blood coming from the wounds that Poggy had inflicted. Shirts were removed and ripped to fashion makeshift bandages, and brandy was poured onto Crumbine's enormous legs to prevent infection. But try as they might, nothing could rouse the new world champion back to consciousness. They didn't know it at the time, but it wasn't the wounds they could see that had caused the collapse. And it wasn't until several days later that the county coroner declared that Crumbine had died from internal hemorrhaging caused by a perforated stomach. It seems that the American's fate was sealed when Poggy landed a blow to his side in the opening seconds of the bout. The kick had cost the Englishman an infraction, and Crumbine his life. The much-anticipated fight was over in just a few short, brutal minutes. The winner had died, and the loser had limped away a broken man. Now, that is what I call a proper sporting occasion. Grandad Bill grinned.